Hey guys! Welcome to the 4th episode of Parliamentary California. It's been a while since I last made an episode of this video series. So, a little bit of recap here. Parliamentary California is a 7-episodic miniseries of me where I will persuade you and Californians of why my home state should adopt a parliamentary system, and also explain how I would implement it in the Golden State as well. Where in the first episode of Parliamentary California, I talked about why we should implement it in the first place. And then in the second episode, I talked about why California should dissolve the state senate and just have their state legislature consist of only the state assembly. And finally, in the third episode, I talked about why we should get rid of term limits for all elected officials except for the lieutenant governor. The second and third episode started to get the ball rolling in talking about several of my ideas on how I would implement a system of government in which the legislature plays a central role in forming the government and holding it to account. The fourth episode is no different, but I decided to split this episode into 2 parts. The first part will be in this video, where I talk about the current system of how we elect our public officials. And then, in the second part, I will discuss the system that I intend to replace it with. I made this decision so that the video doesn't get too long, so I can dive in deep in persuading you why we should get rid of the current electoral system and replace it with the system I chose to replace it with. So let's get started, shall we? This is episode 4, part 1 of Parliamentary California. But before we begin in discussing the current system, we first have to know what electoral systems are. So, electoral systems, it's a specific process through which we, the voters, that are eligible to vote in any particular election, where we have the freedom to choose who represents us in government. So, to reiterate, an electoral system, it's a specific voting system where the electorate participates through this process to elect people that will represent us in government. And there are many ways to run an election. There are many ways to vote. There are many ways of how winners are selected, how we elect people into public office. Do we go with a majoritarian type of system? Do we go with a proportional system where you can have multiple winners get elected? Or how do we nominate people, or how do we even nominate people for general elections? Things such as partisan primaries, top 2, caucuses, conventions, first past the post. There are many types of electoral systems. Many countries use different types of electoral systems. There's not one type of way to run an election. There is many types. There is proportional and non-proportional voting systems. There's many ways to also nominate candidates for the general election as well. But the thing is, though, there's no one way to run an election. There's no one way to vote. There's many ways to run an election, and the point that I'm also trying to make here is that there is no such thing as there is no such thing as a perfect electoral system. All electoral systems come with their pros and cons. They come with their strengths and weaknesses, or their ups and downs. And that's true for every electoral system, even the United States, and also my home state of California's electoral system. So, as we've learned just previously about how there is many different types of electoral systems, and how there is no one type of electoral system, and how there is many different types of electoral systems, and how there's many different types of ways to vote in democratic elections, whether it is through proportional representation, majoritarianism, or voting in person, or voting by mail, or internet voting as well. And how each of all in which all those types of electoral systems come with their pros and cons. They come with different strengths and weaknesses, because there's no such thing as a perfect system. They all come with their pros and cons. But you all may be asking me, why do some countries create different electoral systems? Why do a lot of countries from every corner of the world use different types of electoral systems? And this is in part because it really depends upon their culture. It depends upon their values, their interest, and what they really value most as citizens. If they're more for stable government, they're definitely on the side of less representative democracy, and more on the side of higher vote thresholds, having more single winner elections where only one person can win, which tends to lead to a two-party system. Any majoritarian winner-take-all system would tend to lead to where two parties would begin to form, and then they eventually start dominating the political system. Or some countries, most countries actually will use proportional representation, where multiple candidates can be elected to a geographical multi-member district or from a single statewide constituency. There's many different types of systems, and it really all depends upon what citizens value most. And you all may be asking me, the young centrist, what is our current system? What is the state of California's current electoral system? What is it? What is California's current method to elect our public leaders, from governor to state legislature to members of Congress, and even to the president, for instance? What is our current electoral system? So, well, my friends, the current system to elect our public leaders in the state of California is a top two primary system, where under the top two system, all candidates, regardless of party, run in the same primary, and the top two vote getters advance to the November general election. So, under a top two jungle primary, all voters only vote in one primary, and they have where they can vote for any candidate. Meaning, all the candidates, from Republican candidates, Democratic candidates, Libertarians, Greens, American Independent Party candidates, Peace and Freedom Party candidates, no party preference candidates, and etc. and so forth, they all run in a first round all candidate primary. And the top two vote getters advance to the November general election. The primary can happen usually in either the month of June or March, and then in the general election, it's always November. And the top two primary system is used to elect our leaders from both the governor, the lieutenant governor, the state legislature, members of Congress, secretary of state, attorney general, state controller, and so forth. But the top two primary system is not used for presidential elections, and this is in part because of the part of the reason why we don't use the top two primary system to elect the president is in part because of the electoral college, the complexities of the electoral college, and how it really relies a lot more on political parties. So it's different, and this is in part, and this leads me to another type of electoral system, another type of primary system that's way different from top two primary systems. So for presidential elections, California still uses party primaries, where individual political parties, which are private organizations, they run their own mini primary elections where only members of their political party can only vote in that party's primary to choose who represents them in the general election. So, it's usually whoever gets the most votes in that party's primary will win that state's party. Will win that state in that party's primary. Will win that state's presidential primary and take all the party's delegates. So, if you're a Republican voter in California, you only vote in the Republican presidential primary. And if you're a Democrat, you only vote in the Democratic presidential primary. But there are some cases where some parties do allow no party preference voters to vote in their primaries. So sometimes the Democratic Party of California will allow no party preference voters, people who are not affiliated with any political party, and where they can be free to vote in the Democratic Party, and political parties do this to essentially broaden their electorate, to broaden their base. And that's why they do it. But I digress. Partisan primaries are systems where only members of a political party can vote in that party's primary, and whoever wins in that party's primary will usually be that party's nominee for president of the United States. But partisan or party primaries and top two primaries are similar in a way, because they are both majoritarian type of voting systems where only one candidate can win. It's a little bit multi-winner in top two, just kind of, because in the first round, all candidate primary, only two people can advance to the general election, and then only one winner can win in the November general election. So it's kind of multi-winner, but it really only applies for the first round all candidate primary, and then in the second round, where only the top two candidates advance, it's only one person that's winning. so in the end, it's still a majoritarian voting system, and that applies to also partisan primaries that California uses to nominate, where political parties run their own mini private elections, where parties nominate their own presidential candidates rather than just use the top two primary system. So, and you already know, and as you learned through those last two slides, you may, as you have learned a little bit about the current system, you may have already also learned that there are two different types of primary systems. There is top two primaries, and then there is partisan primaries. So, as I said earlier, partisan primaries are primaries where only people that are registered with one political party in any state can only vote in that party's primary. While top two primaries allow all voters and candidates to vote and or run in the same party scheduled on either March or June. And this depends on state law pretty much. And these are the similarity between these primary systems is that they're both majoritarian single winner systems, but they are different. One primary system only allows people registered with that political party to only vote in that party's primary. But in top two primaries, all voters and all candidates, regardless of party, vote and run in one singular unified primary, and the top two vote getters, regardless of party, advance to the general election. And like I said earlier on, there's no such thing as a perfect electoral system. Every electoral system comes with its strengths and weaknesses. So, and that is true with partisan primaries and top two primaries. So, the one strength with partisan primaries is that it allows political parties to be free to nominate their candidates however they choose. And with partisan primaries, this actually rewards partisan and more and extreme ideological candidates, as only members of that political party can vote in the primary. But in top two primary systems, it rewards and helps moderates get elected to either Congress or in the state legislature. So, and I'll get to that later on. Another strength of partisan primaries is that there's no such thing as same party general elections, which can happen under top two primaries. So in partisan primaries, since all political parties are free to nominate their candidates however they choose, and only members of that political party can only vote in that party's primary. Every party member votes in their own party's primary, and then they nominate, and political parties nominate at least one candidate to run in the general election, to represent that party in the general election. This means that no party is excluded from the general election ballot because of relying on partisan primaries. And that is why partisan primaries give more voice to political parties. While when it comes to top two primaries, this produces same party general elections where the relation between partisanship, ideology, and voting are much weaker, because there is no role that voters' partisan loyalties can plan on in how they ultimately vote in the end. So to wrap it all up, top two primaries is where really partisanship, ideological partisanship, partisan loyalties or ideology hardly plays a role in electing leaders, because all voters and all candidates, regardless of party, run in the same primary. But in partisan primaries, political parties play more of a role in deciding who runs in the general election, and that completely depends on who the party nominates. So overall, top two primary systems are primaries where all voters and all candidates vote in just one primary, no segregated or mini primary elections happening, and partisan primaries are separate individual private mini elections where parties only allow members of their political party to vote in that party's primary to decide who represents them in the general election. And that's the key difference between top two and partisan primaries. Now, since you know the current electoral system that California uses for governor, congressional, state legislature, U.S. Senate, and for elections to the presidency, you now all may be asking me why California uses this system. Well, we can thank this man, former Lieutenant Governor Abel Maldonado, and we can also thank this man, former Governor Arnold Schwarzenegger. You see, both men campaigned hard for Prop 14 back in the year of 2010, in part because they believed it would reduce partisanship and incentivize lawmakers to work with anyone, regardless of party, to get things done. Their hard work is what has allowed Proposition 14 to pass on June 8th of 2010, which established the top two jungle primary or top two primary system for all elected offices in California except for presidential elections. It was supported by other organizations too, which include the AAR California Organization, the Latin Business Organization, the California Alliance for Jobs, and the California Chamber of Commerce. And the first election that the top two jungle primary system was used was in the 2014 election. The very first election where the top two system was used for governor, for all the other statewide offices, which include the Secretary of State, Attorney General, Lieutenant Governor, and also congressional and state legislative elections as well. And ever since 2014, California has always used the top two jungle primary system from being, they used it in 2016, 2018, 2020, 2022, and 2024, except for presidential elections, as I said earlier. So, why did my home state choose to adopt Proposition 14? This is the answer that I will go into for several reasons, as there are several reasons why California chose to adopt Proposition 14. And there are also other reasons why top two, top four, or top five jungle primaries or all candidate primaries sound really appealing, and why many people advocated for it, not just in California, but also in other states as well. So that's what I will be talking about, why California chose to adopt Proposition 14, which established top two jungle or all candidate primaries. So let's get started, shall we? So before Proposition 14, prior to Proposition 14, the state of California's government was the most polarized in the nation. It was worst because in 2010, the state broke the record for the most consecutive days without a state budget. This marked the 16th year where the state legislature did not approve of a timely budget, and many advocates for Prop 14 used it as evidence of why we should change the primary system in California from partisan to top two primaries. So, during around 2010, before Prop 14, the California state government was immensely polarized and also broken as well. People such as former Lieutenant Governor Abel Maldonado even said, "We're tired of these Republicans fighting the Democrats and the Democrats fighting the Republicans, and guess who loses? The people lose and the people pay." So, to reiterate again, California state government during this time was broken, said a lot of advocates, they believed that the primary cause of why the Golden State's public institutions were broken is in part because we had too many politicians in Sacramento choosing rigid partisan positions and appeasing special interest rather than working together to solve the issue that's plaguing the Golden State. These are several of the reasons that proponents advertised on to promote Prop 14, and a lot of these messaging by advocates said it was time to end the bickering, the gridlock, and to ultimately fix the system to work better for we the people. Politicians won't do it, but Prop 14 can, because it will open up all primaries to all voters and to all candidates regardless of party affiliation. It was the idea to reduce polarization in theory. In theory. I want you all to keep that in mind. But there are other reasons for Proposition 14 to pass and why many people advocated for top two jungle primaries or top two all candidate primary elections. The other reasons is that it would allow no party preference voters to have a voice in the first round all candidate primary, or in other words, to have a voice in primary elections in general. As well, they say it would also encourage candidate moderation by reducing less ideological candidates that will thus reduce polarization. For instance, in safe Republican or Democratic districts, it's possible for two Democrats facing off in one general election, while in another district, you can have two Republicans facing off. So, going back to what I said earlier in a previous slide, partisan loyalties and ideologies were less of a factor when voters showed up to the polls to vote. This is the main selling point for top 2, 4, or even 5 jungle primaries. It was the main selling point for top 2, 4, or 5 jungle primaries was to for one, allow all no party preference voters to have a voice in primary elections, because they say that by restricting voters in partisan primaries where only party members, where only small numbers of people only vote in primary elections, where 8 to 10% of voters only vote, where Republicans vote in their own primaries, Democrats vote in their own primaries, Libertarians vote in their own primaries, Greens vote only in their primaries. They say that since those primary elections are taxpayer funded, elections that we pay for, then those type of primaries should be open to all voters, because those voters pay for those primary elections anyway. So why are parties excluding no party preference voters that make up a significant chunk of the electorate, especially in California? And also it was to encourage candidate moderation, because it would encourage and force candidates to reach out to a broader electorate in one unified primary with all the candidates and all the voters voting and running regardless of party affiliation. And this would disincentivize the political extremes, and also disincentivize partisan loyalties and ideologies, where people can actually vote for the candidate that is most qualified, and also people who are more willing to work with anyone to get stuff done, and also to pretty much get stuff done on behalf of California and also the United States as well. But to go even further, so in top 2 jungle primaries or top 4, you can have in safe Republican or Democratic districts, it's possible for 2 Democrats to face off in one general election, while in another district you can have 2 Republicans facing off. So in California, for instance, in the Bay Area of California, San Francisco, Oakland, Alameda County, you might get 2 Democrats facing off in the general election, which actually makes more sense because those areas are predominantly and more traditionally Democratic. And if you have only 2 Democrats, that actually reduces partisan loyalties as a factor for why voters show up to vote, which would actually incentivize voters to actually pick between the representative, the candidate that would be more representative and accountable to them. And also it would also encourage a candidate to actually be more moderate, to the point where he's reaching out to a broader electorate and not just his ideological base. And the same is true if it's in a more rural part of California, such as the Central Valley area or Fresno or Bakersfield. It's very well possible to get 2 Republicans, and because of that would actually encourage moderation, to the point where those 2 Republicans will face off, and in theory, voters would likely choose the more moderate candidate in theory, which would thus increase political competition, through an intra-party lens, meaning there would be more intra-party fighting, because now the Republicans are with 2 Republicans in one election, in one general election, in one district, and 2 Democrats in one general election. That could actually encourage, those parties would now have to spend a little more resources to prop up their party loyalists now, because those more moderate Republicans or more moderate Democrats could actually stand a better shot at actually winning re-election in top 2 jungle primaries rather than partisan primaries. So, and this goes to another reason why many advocates support top 2 or top 4 or top 5 jungle primaries, and why it may seem appealing. You see, when it comes to partisan primaries, only 8 through 10% of voters effectively end up electing 83% of our Congress. You see, and as I said earlier, in congressional districts that are lopsided in favor of Republicans, an incumbent Republican has to vote alongside their party. They have to vote with the party, or else they have to vote with the party. So to reiterate again, in lopsided Republican congressional districts, and this can be in a district in Texas or West Virginia, Oklahoma, or even a safe Republican district in a rural part of California, those Republicans are forced to vote are supposed to vote with their party if they want to win their party's nomination in the next election. And if they don't vote with their party or if they don't vote with their party or vote against their party on anything, they risk themselves of getting primaried out by a new Republican that is much more ideological, partisan, extreme, and loyal to their party. And loyal to the party that will do a much better job at representing the party. So Republicans in the old-fashioned partisan primary elections, they have to behave more ideological and more partisan and more extreme in nature, because partisan primaries, like it or not, only a very small number of the population, of the electorate, only vote in these low turnout primary elections, around 8 to 10%. And a lot of those elections effectively end up electing 83% of our Congress, and which thus increases political extremism and thus creates a more dysfunctional, unrepresentative, unresponsive, and unaccountable government, which allows the extremes to essentially dominate the conversation. And this is true also for Democrats as well. And this is true for if you're either a Republican or a Democrat. So, for instance, Senator Lankford of Oklahoma, during the 2024 election, Senator Lankford worked with Democrats and also former President Joe Biden on a bipartisan immigration bill or immigration legislation that would help secure the border. It also included other funding as well to give money to other countries such as Ukraine and Israel. But it was a bipartisan bill that would secure our country's immigration borders. And what happened was Donald Trump told Republican members of Congress, even Speaker of the House Mike Johnson at the time, to essentially kill the bill. Don't bring the bill up to a vote in the House of Representatives, because he didn't want the Democrats or Biden taking credit for solving the immigration crisis. Trump actually wanted to take the credit for solving the immigration issue, which makes sense in terms of politics. If you want to win elections, you got to make the other governing party look bad. You got to make them look bad as much. You got to make the other party look bad as much as possible, so more Americans feel more inclined to vote for you and not the other party. So, and this is and what happened was Senator Lankford wasn't getting on board with Donald Trump and the rest of the Republicans, which led to the Oklahoma Republican Party to essentially censor Senator Lankford, and he stands at a risk of getting primaried out when he's up for re-election. I don't remember what year, but he will be up for re-election. But he could possibly risk the possibility of getting primaried out by a more party loyalist that would be more loyal and ideological to Trump and the Republican Party. And that's all, and that's true for Democrats as well. Also, back in 2018, Joe Crowley lost his primary to Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez in the Bronx, in part because there was other factors as well. But that really goes to show you that partisan primaries, where only a small number of the electorate chooses votes in those primaries, which end up electing 83% of our Congress, is one of the reasons why many people advocate for top 2, 4, or 5 primaries, and it's in part because to them it seems appealing and is the answer to a more representative, responsive, and accountable government. So this is why top 2, 4, or 5 primaries may seem appealing, and why many people, such as Unite America, advocate for it, because they say that the problem with partisan primaries, where only a small number of ideological voters vote, is that it rewards political extremists, which is thus why Congress is dysfunctional and gridlock. And people such as Nick Troiano, the executive director of Unite America, believed by opening up primaries to all voters and candidates, then candidates would have to campaign to a broader electorate, which would thus force them to moderate their positions and would therefore disincentivize extremism. The ideal behind jungle primaries or all candidate primaries that are open to everyone or universal to everyone is that it would disincentivize the extremes, reduce partisanship, and incentivize candidate moderation as well, which would thus lead to a more functional, representative, and accountable. This would thus lead to a more functional, representative, accountable, and responsive government. So, to reiterate again, the idea behind jungle primaries or all candidate primaries open to everyone is that it would disincentivize the extremes, reduce partisanship, and incentivize candidate moderation as well, which would thus lead to a more functional, representative, accountable, and responsive government, which was the main talking points of people such as Nick Troiano, Unite America, Arnold Schwarzenegger, Abel Maldonado, for instance. They say that it would be the key to a more functional, representative, accountable, and responsive government for all. So, with Californian voters deciding to pass Proposition 14 on the month and year of June 8th of 2010, which established the top 2 jungle primaries in all candidate primary elections, Proposition 14 had both positive and negative effects to California's elections. And I'll be going into those effects right now, actually. So, one of the effects that top 2 primaries has had on the state of California's elections is that it led to same-party general elections. What same-party general elections are is where 2 candidates from the same party both advance to a second runoff election that will be held in November. Where a Democrat versus a Democrat where you can actually have a November general election being either between a Democrat versus a Democrat or a Republican versus a Republican. Same party general elections can be both good and bad. So let's actually discuss some of the good effects of same party general elections. So, my very first election that I voted in as a Californian voter was the 2018 primary election, where in this election, I voted in the United States Senate race. I voted for the governor of California, lieutenant governor, House races, state legislatures, and so forth. And in the 2018 California United States Senate race, in the November part of the general election, there was no Republican candidate facing off against a Democrat. And this is in part because of the effects of top two jungle or all candidate primaries. And I'll get to one of those effects when I start talking about some of the bad effects of same party general elections. But I'll hint at it right now, actually. So the reason why the Republicans didn't get a candidate in the November general election in the 2018 California United States Senate race is in part because there were just too many candidates running in the June 5th primary. Too many Republican candidates running in the June 5th primary. And what happened is this actually weakened Republican support. With Republican candidates not coalescing around a candidate, this is what prevented them from getting a candidate in the November general election. This is actually what vote splitting is what actually excluded them from the general election in November back in 2018 in the United States Senate race. And this is what allowed two Democrats, Dianne Feinstein and Kevin DeLeon, to be the top two candidates that got the most votes in the first round all-candidate primary or jungle primary to both face off against each other in the November general election. Despite the fact that they're two Democrats. This can actually be a good... having two Democrats face off in the United States in a United States Senate race, especially in California, actually makes sense if you think about it. California, like it or not, is still a traditionally and lopsided Democratic state. Yes, there are still Republican voters, but like it or not, the majority of the voters in California are Democrats. And the last time it voted for a Republican candidate for president was 1988 with George Herbert Walker Bush. But I digress. It really doesn't make a whole awful sense for the Republicans to actually run a candidate for the United States Senate race. It really doesn't make that much sense because a Republican doesn't really stand a chance at winning in California. And it actually makes more sense to actually have two Democrats on the November general election ballot, or maybe a Democrat or another left-wing or progressive candidate on the general election ballot for United States Senate or for governor, or in a safer congressional district that's more left-wing and more progressive. In part because they stand a better shot at actually winning and defeating an establishment candidate. And that's really one of the positives of top two or same party general elections. And this is something I already discussed in a previous slide. One of the effects that top two primaries or top 4 or 5 primaries can have on the November general election is that partisan loyalties aren't really a factor, or ideological voting isn't really that big of a factor in these type of primaries. Because if you get two Democrats on the November general election ballot, or even two Republicans on the November general election ballot, voters are actually not really concerned about ideology or partisan loyalty anymore. And that can actually be a good thing, because now they can just look at the candidate now. They can actually look at them as people and not just see that they have a party label next to their name. Because like it or not, whether we like it or not, I don't really think any Democrat is going to vote for a Republican candidate for U.S. Senate. They would still likely go with another Democratic candidate, even if they don't like that establishment candidate, because they would. It's part of our system of first past the post voting, where people just vote for the lesser of the two evils, who stands a better shot at beating the candidate that you don't want to get elected. And since California is a more Democratic state, Democratic voters will be more inclined to vote for a Democrat rather than a Republican. So it really makes a whole awful sense to have two Democrats on the general election ballot, or have an establishment candidate versus a progressive on the November general election ballot, because it would actually make things more competitive, and it would actually challenge the status quo. It would challenge the establishment. It would challenge the wealthy elite in the November general election, because it would give them an actual real run for their money, because partisan loyalties, polarization, ideology aren't really a factor. The only really factor is intra-party division in this type of chaotic election. And even if Republicans or other third parties didn't get a candidate to make the November general election ballot, they can still turn out and vote, and they would probably, maybe they would vote for the establishment, or maybe they could actually vote for the outsider, or the anti-establishment candidate, which means you are encouraging candidates to actually reach out to a broader electorate. Because back in the 2018 California United States Senate race, Kevin DeLeon actually did very well amongst Republican areas. Republican vote did especially well amongst Republican voters. And during this time, I was still Republican at this time, and I voted for Kevin DeLeon. Even my father did as well. This is actually, he did very well amongst Republican voters, and he actually, all the counties that were in California that were traditionally Republican, like Kern County, which represents Bakersfield, for instance, he actually won that county, and he actually did very well, which meant that the Republicans actually were able to coalesce around a Democrat. They were able to set aside their partisan loyalties. They were able to set aside their differences with a candidate, and they were able to pull themselves together. But it wasn't still enough to actually for Kevin DeLeon to defeat Dianne Feinstein, since Dianne Feinstein still won re-election, the late Senator Dianne Feinstein. But it really goes to show that same party general elections are actually, in some areas, actually a good thing, because it allows for more competition. It allows for more competition, and it encourages really candidate moderation, because, like it or not, Republicans really don't stand a chance to win in a United States Senate race in California. Just wait a few more years, maybe they can. But but currently, right now, it's not the case right now. And it makes it more feasible and more worth the time to actually, instead of voting for a party member in this specific primary, you can just coalesce around a candidate that you can actually stand to actually defeat the candidate you most like, that you dislike. But I know many people don't like doing that. But this is one of the benefits with with top two or top two jungle primaries and all candidate primaries, is that it produces competitive same party general elections, where a district that appears to be lopsidedly Democratic, you can definitely get two Democrats in there, and partisan loyalty isn't really a factor anymore. Party labels aren't really a factor, where it actually encourages candidate moderation and actually gives the establishment a real run for their money. It gives the wealthy elite a real run for their money, where a true political outsider of the system can actually defeat the establishment, the political establishment. And this is true when it comes to a safe Republican congressional district. And this happened also in 2018 in the California 8th Congressional District election, when two Republicans, being incumbent Paul Cook and Tim Donnelly, were the top two candidates in the first round all-candidate primary. And they faced off against each other in the November general election. And this was in part because the Democratic voter base was still split, even though the Democrat Marge Doyle, as you see here, where it was able to get 21.7% of the vote. So if she did get a little bit more votes, she could have gotten into the top two. But because the Democratic voter base was split, that excluded the Democrat candidates, the Democratic Party's candidates, from the general election ballot in the 8th Congressional District, which allowed for two Republicans to advance, which meant partisan loyalties don't really matter that much anymore, because now voters can just look beyond the party and just look at the person and just vote for the candidate that best aligned with their values and their interests. And it actually makes elections a lot more competitive, which happened in the 2018 California United States Senate race. So, and this is a positive effect, because with the benefit of same party general elections in a safer Republican district is that it allows for more competition, and it allows for moderates to actually be able to actually have a chance to win re-election. And political moderates in Congress or in the state legislature is a good thing, because we always need bridge builders that can work with anyone to actually just get stuff done and address and implement policies that make our lives better, that make our lives better in society, which is 100% a good thing. I think we do need political moderation, but where we have leaders who are more concerned at building coalitions with other parties, with other politicians from outside of their party, but realize that they do have some things in common to be able to work with each other in getting stuff done on behalf of the American people and on behalf of Californians. So this is just one positive effect of same party general elections. But same party general elections, which happen under top two, can also be a bad thing. And for one, and the reason why it can be a bad thing is that one of the bad sides with top two is that it complicates the process, in part because you can have too many candidates on the primary election ballot, which means you can have 10, 20, or 40, or 50, or even 100 candidates on the primary election ballot. This can overwhelm the voter. This can complicate the process to the point where the voter might just guess vote, or he has to do a lot more research, or he might not vote at all. It further complicates the process with these type of jungle primaries or all candidate primaries. It complicates the process, because one of the big benefits of partisan primaries, where Republicans vote in their own Republican primary, Democrats vote in their own primary, Libertarians vote in their own primary, Greens vote in their own primary, American Independents vote in their own primary, Peace and Freedoms vote in their own primary, and so forth. One of the benefits of having allowing the political parties to nominate their own candidates for the general election is that it doesn't exclude them from the general election ballot, and it actually gives the voters greater power as the voting process to be able to choose who represents that party in the general election is determined by the party's members, voters in a specific state or congressional district, which it actually simplifies the process to the point it actually rewards intra-party unity. It rewards intra-party unity where Republicans or Democrats, Libertarians, Greens can all be united towards a common goal at either winning the Senate majority, of either winning the House of Representatives majority, of either winning the presidency, or either winning a specific governor's race, and so forth. It simplifies the process, which gives the voters greater power. And jungle primaries are really a lot more complicated, and in my opinion, they weaken voters' power. And there's many reasons of why too many candidates weaken voters' power. And for one of another bad side of top 2 primaries, or top 3 or top 4 or top 5 primaries, is that it can lead to a lot more vote splitting. You can have a lot more vote splitting in the first all candidate primary round. So if there are too many Democrats or either a Republican running in the all candidate primary, that could prevent a party from advancing their candidate to the general election ballot, which leads to same party general elections. It leads to 2 Republicans on the general election ballot or 2 Democrats on the general election ballot. And this happened in the 2018 California United States Senate race, and it happened in California's U.S. House race of District 8. And like I said earlier, this excludes parties that are in the minority from the general election ballot. It excludes them. And because of that, it actually also, top 2, also weakens alternative parties. It weakens third parties and minority parties. It reduces their power and or leverage, because like it or not, it makes it harder for third parties to actually gain traction. It makes it harder for them to actually to be able to form and actually build up a voter base. It's a lot harder because these type of third parties, being libertarians, Greens, Peace and Freedom, they have a very small voter base. And with top 2, this can actually undermine them to the point where they can't get a candidate into the general election, which makes it a lot harder for them to actually have power and leverage of who ultimately wins the election, which is a bad thing completely. And the only way for a third party candidate to actually win in a top 2 primary is if either the Democrats or Republican candidates voter base are completely split, or maybe one of the major party candidates decided to coalesce around a third party candidate instead. Those are really the only ways a third party candidate could actually get into the top 2, is if the 2 major parties' voter base is completely split and fragmented, and or if another major party candidate coalesces around a third party candidate. But overall, top 2 primaries weakens and hurts third parties. It doesn't benefit them, it hurts third parties, which ultimately means it favors the 2-party system. Top 2 really does favor the 2-party system. It favors more established and wealthy parties. It favors the ultra-billionaire class. It favors the corrupt oligarchy that we see in Washington, that we also see in Sacramento as well. It weakens alternative parties, and it hurts them because it prevents them from actually growing in being able to present themselves as a better alternative party that give voters the alternative that they are looking for from the Democrats and Republicans, so that they can elect a better party that better represents them, better aligns with them, and can better do their business in actually governing and making the people's lives better in California and in the United States. So, and also, and And speaking of it favoring the more established and wealthy parties, it also leads to a lot of negative campaigning and candidate prop up, which vote splitting can contribute to vote splitting also. And because of that, this also favors the more established and wealthy parties. It favors the ultra rich. It favors the establishment candidates. This is what happened in the 2024 California U.S. Senate primary. You see, the Democratic voter base was split between Adam Schiff and Katie Porter and Barbara Lee in the primary, in both the open and special open primary. This is what allowed Garvey to get the most votes in the special open primary and in the regular open primary or regular jungle primary, where he tied with Adam Schiff for first place. And with a lot of this vote splitting, this can lead to a lot more negative campaigning and candidate prop up. At any of these two-round elections, these two-round primary elections where all candidates and all voters vote in just one primary, no segregated party primary elections, this can lead to a lot more negative campaigning and candidate prop up, which actually favors the wealthy establishment. It favors the corrupt oligarchy. And these people represent both Adam Schiff and Steve Garvey. You see, during the 2024 California United States Senate race primary, Adam Schiff propped up Steve Garvey. And if you don't know the term candidate prop up is when a candidate props up another candidate to get them into the runoff and or November general election to avoid a competitive and costly general election with a stronger oppositional candidate. This is what Adam Schiff did in the 2024 United States Senate race in California. In part because he didn't want to face off against another Democrat, a more progressive Democrat, which would have been Katie Porter, because he wanted to avoid a costly and competitive general election. And this goes back to one of the positives with same party general elections and what I said earlier is that realistically a Republican doesn't really stand much of a chance to win a Senate seat in California. It really doesn't stand much a chance in our current day and age because of how polarized and divided we are as a country. A Republican doesn't really stand that much of a chance to actually win. And Katie Porter was actually the more logical choice to actually go up against Adam Schiff, because Katie Porter would have been the more realistic alternative to actually be able to defeat Adam Schiff in the November general election. And if Katie Porter was able to make the top two, I would have voted for her over Adam Schiff, because I don't like Adam Schiff, but I voted for Porter in the primary, but voted for Schiff in the general election because I didn't like Garvey at all. But I digress. But the point I'm making is that even though same party general elections leads to competitive elections, because even if since a Republican doesn't really stand a much big chance to win a Senate seat a U.S. Senate seat in California, it makes it more realistic for Republicans to actually get another Democrat such as Katie Porter into the top two spot over getting Garvey in the top two spot, because Katie Porter would have actually made the race a lot more competitive and a lot more closer, which would have challenged the wealthy establishment. It would have challenged the party of the rich. And that is something what Adam Schiff wanted to avoid. He wanted to avoid a competitive and costly November general election at all costs. So the Schiff campaign spent around $10 million on attack ads that attacked U.S. Senate candidate Steve Garvey to purposefully target Republican voters and getting them to vote for Garvey, so that Garvey was the one that made the top 2 spot in November rather than Katie Porter. This is what really prevented Californians from having a competitive November general election. Competition, even though it can be a bad thing to have too much competition, competition can also be a good thing because it can give California the much needed attention, the much needed national attention. And if there is a more competitive general election, which is completely good for California. It can mean more, the national parties can put more attention to it, give more attention to our state to actually campaign and win our votes harder. Adam Schiff would have to campaign a lot harder, which is a good thing actually, but that's not what Adam Schiff wanted. So this sort of candidate prop-up, where a candidate spends huge sums of money, from thousands to millions to billions of dollars, just to prop up a token candidate to avoid a competitive and costly general election with a stronger oppositional candidate. This type of candidate prop-up favors the rich. It favors the wealthy establishment. It favors the two-party system. It keeps the corrupt oligarchy in power. It keeps the establishment in power. It keeps the status quo in power. You know, when we the people's votes, when we the people are fragmented and split, the people in power actually win. But when we're united, the establishment loses. This is why, and that is why Adam Schiff why Adam Schiff spent thousands and millions of dollars on negative attack ads, on negative campaigning, to actually purposefully divide the Democratic vote in the primary, and to also prop up Steve Garvey. Because he knew that Steve Garvey would have been a weaker and token candidate to be able to easily cruise to victory. Adam Schiff knew that he would have defeated a Republican candidate easier than another Democrat, which ultimately meant that competition reduced in top 2 primaries, because, like it or not, this top 2 favors the wealthy and favors the establishment elite. It allows the corrupt oligarchy and the establishment parties, being the Democrats and the Republicans, it allows them to pick and choose who are the candidates to be in the top 2 spot, because they have the money to actually raise huge sums of money and spend massive amounts of money to be able to get their chosen candidates in the general election, where one candidate would be their endorsed candidate and the other candidate would just be a token candidate. He would be where he would be a weaker candidate. It would be a token candidate to prop up the establishment, prop up the wealthy elite, purposefully and intentionally dividing the electorate. And this really means, what this really means is the Democrats and the Republicans are really the party of the rich. Like it or not, they are the party of the rich. These are two corporate parties that are really only in it for money and in self-interest. And this type of candidate prop-up also happened in the 2018 California gubernatorial election. It also happened where Governor Gavin Newsom propped up his Republican opponent, John Cox, to ensure Cox made the top 2 spot and not Los Angeles Mayor Antonio Vigorosa. And this connects right back to the 2024 California U.S. Senate primary because, like Adam Schiff, Gavin Newsom did not want to go up against another Democrat. He actually wanted to face off against another Republican. So what did he do? He spent huge sums of money to prop up his Republican opponent, purposefully divide the Democratic electorate to ensure that it's just him and Cox in the November general election. This type of primary structure, the top two primary system, these jungle primaries favor the wealthy. These top two primaries favor the wealthy. This sort of political strategization and negative campaigning is all designed to favor the political establishment and the wealthy oligarch elite that run our government in Sacramento and in Congress. Top two primaries favor the wealthy establishment because they can very well strategize, raise huge sums of money, and then spend huge sums of money on negative campaign ads to purposefully divide us and fragment us from a bunch of different candidates to purposefully prop up their endorsed establishment candidates who support the current status quo, the wealthy oligarch elite, and also prop up a token oppositional candidate, a weaker candidate, where the rich are the ones that ultimately win in the end. The rich, under top two primaries, can pick and choose who is in the top two spot. And as Americans, I think we all agree that money has too much power in Congress, and top two doesn't really do that much in reducing the amount of influence that money plays in Congress. How much lobbyists and big donors actually have so much where big donors have so much influence. We should be giving the people more power rather than money in the wealthy elite in deciding our elections. We the people should decide that, not the wealthy elite. Not the wealthy elite. So this leads me into this overall conclusion leads me to the fact that Prop 14 should be repealed. The top two open primary system should be repealed and replaced. For one, the reason why top two primaries or top four, top five primaries should be replaced is, for one, it reduces competition and or choice by excluding other parties. It favors the wealthy two major party establishment. It favors the corrupt oligarchy in Washington and Sacramento. And it's also too complex for the voters. It takes away political parties' rights to nominate their candidates and to vote on a platform that they will sell to the voters. This is why Prop 14 should be repealed and replaced. So now since we know why Prop 14 should be repealed and replaced, this is the end of Part 1, Episode 4 of Parliamentary California. And in Part 2 of Episode 4 of Parliamentary California, I will be sharing the very electoral system that will replace the top two jungle primary system. So, thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the second part of Episode 4 of Parliamentary California.